In April 2025, Donald Trump had announced one of the world's steepest tariff rates. It was seen as a bold move to protect American industries and reduce reliance on foreign goods. The policy introduced a universal 10% tariff on all imports, with much higher rates for certain countries like China and Vietnam. And if we were to pull up the list of countries that received these reciprocal tariffs, we would see that countries like China and Japan had received shockingly steep tariffs. Regions like the European Union, which have long been one of America's biggest allies, also received tariffs of over 20%. But there is one country on this list, and it's actually missing, so we'll add it. Here, on the list, which we just added, is a country known as Singapore. Singapore, as you can see, didn't really receive that big of a tariff rate. Its tariff rate stood at just 10%. That's very low, especially if we compare it to other Southeast and East Asian economies. Vietnam, for instance, which has an economic status that is far below that of Singapore, has received over 46% in tariff rates, yet Singapore, for some reason, only had 10%. That's quite weird now, isn't it? Why would Donald Trump spare Singapore, a country with one of the most advanced economies in Asia, while heavily targeting its neighbors? Well, the answer here is honestly very simple, and that can be seen as to how Donald Trump implemented his reciprocal tariffs. When Trump announced his reciprocal tariffs, many observers were wondering, how did Trump calculate his tariffs on other countries? For instance, countries like Vietnam actually voiced concern about Trump's tariffs. Vietnam didn't really impose such high tariffs against the United States, yet Trump imposed over 46% on the country. Trump's administration calculated the rates based on each country's trade deficit with the United States, then divided it by the total imports from that nation. And then, if the result was more than the baseline 10%, he simply halved that number to arrive at the reciprocal tariff. Put simply, the bigger the trade deficit America had with a country, the higher the tariff that country would face. And this was regardless of whether the country actually had high tariffs or unfair trade practices. And you can easily see this if we graph out the United States deficit partners. Here on the graph, you can see some of the largest trading partners which have a big surplus with the United States. You can see China, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, and a long list of other economies that has high surpluses against the US. And these very economies have seen high US tariff rates. So, that's the case we have for Singapore. If we were to add Singapore in this graph, we get to see that Singapore doesn't actually have a surplus against the US. In fact, it has the exact opposite. Here, you can see that countries like Vietnam have a trade surplus against the US at a tune of over $123 billion. But as you can see, Singapore doesn't actually have a trade surplus with the United States. They have a deficit of over $2.8 billion. What this all means is that unlike Vietnam, which sells more to the US than it buys, Singapore actually buys more from the US than it sells. Indeed, despite being one of the most advanced economies in Asia and a major global trading hub, Singapore maintains a relatively balanced and even US-favorable trade relationship. To understand how this really works, let's pull up the graph on the exports and imports of the United States with Singapore. Here on the graph, you can see just how much the US exports or imports from Singapore. There are years when the US imported more from Singapore, and there are years when they exported more. So, you might be wondering, why is this the case? Why is Singapore, a global trading hub and known as one of the world's richest economies, not selling to the United States like China, Vietnam, Japan, or South Korea? Well, the answer lies in what these countries sell to the US and what Singapore sells to the US. China, Vietnam, Japan, and South Korea are well known to be manufacturing powerhouses. These countries specialize in mass production of consumer goods, electronics, automobiles, textiles, and machinery, all of which are heavily demanded by American consumers and businesses. For instance, China exports everything from smartphones and furniture to toys and industrial components. Vietnam has become a top supplier of apparel, footwear, and consumer electronics. Japan and South Korea, meanwhile, ship millions of cars, semiconductors, and high-end electronics to the US every year. Singapore, on the other hand, does not provide massive amounts of volume. Instead, they provide specialized products like pharmaceutics, semiconductor chips, and re-export products. For instance, if we graph out the exports of Singapore to the United States by category, we get to see that Singapore's largest exports to the US are electronics, machineries, products related to medical and chemicals. These products aren't basic goods like agriculture or automotive. Rather, they are actually needed in the United States. The point is, not only is the United States not losing an industry or jobs to Singapore, they are actually helping the US by providing necessary and important goods. So these factors help Singapore avoid the steep tariffs that other Asian economies get to have. Now, that's not really the only reason out there. While this has not been mentioned like other mainstream reasons, it is also important to know that Singapore virtually has no protective tariffs of its own. Singapore practices what it preaches on free trade. It is one of the most open economies in the world. The Singapore government levies zero import duty on nearly 100% of products. In fact, it has 0% MFN, most favored nation tariffs, on all but a few items. The only exceptions are basically for things like alcoholic beverages, tobacco, motor vehicles, and petroleum products, largely for domestic regulatory reasons, not to shield local industry. This unilateral free trade stance means Singapore isn't restricting US exports. American companies can freely sell their goods in Singapore without tariff barriers. The US appreciates this. It enjoys access to the Singapore market. This is one of the reasons why the US is able to sell a lot of goods to Singapore without facing any of the usual roadblocks that come with international trade. So, this basically removes a classic justification for US tariffs, the reciprocal argument that if you tax our goods, we'll tax yours. Since Singapore isn't taxing US goods, the US has no rationale to reciprocate. In fact, during debates about reciprocal tariffs, Singapore often gets a pass for having virtually none. Now, this doesn't mean that everything would now be okay. For one, the US still applied a 10% tariff rate on Singaporean goods. That basically puts them on similar rates to the likes of the United Kingdom, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and so on. So, with this 10% tariff rate, what could potentially pose a problem to Singapore? And are there any solutions for this? Well, let's first talk about the potential problems of this 10% rate. According to various analysts and industry observers, a 10% tariff rate on Singapore isn't going to impact their economy as much as economies like Vietnam or China. However, what could significantly impact Singapore is the ripple effect of Trump's large tariffs on other economies. The reason being is because Singapore is a key node in global supply chains. It doesn't just export its own products. It acts as a crucial transit and processing hub for goods moving in and out of Southeast Asia. In other words, Singapore is deeply embedded in the flow of international trade. So, if Trump's higher tariffs on countries like Vietnam, China, or Thailand slow down their exports to the US, that slowdown could ripple through Singapore as well. You can see the effects of the tariff on Singapore possibly through the stock market. While it is obviously not the definite answer, it is part of the broader picture that reflects market sentiment and investor expectations. When Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs, global markets responded almost immediately, and Singapore's Straits Times Index, STI, was no exception. Here you can see that the STI dropped, but it didn't really drop as big as other economies. For instance, if we graphed out Japan's Nikkei 225, we get to see that they have seen a sharper and more immediate decline. And that is indeed because of the much steeper tariff Japan received, a 24% rate compared to Singapore's 10%. On solutions, Singapore won't retaliate against these tariffs. Instead, they said that engagement is needed. They would most likely opt for quiet diplomacy and structured trade dialogue with the United States. But as we haven't seen any progress for Trump's tariffs as of late, we may leave it for now. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.